Unfortunately, there are other microorganisms besides bacteria and virus, some of which are pathogenic, some of which aren't, some of which are opportunistic pathogens, meaning if they get in the wrong place at the right time for them, they can become pathogenic. So learning objectives, do antibiotics kill viruses, fungi, or protozoa? Why or why not? What does the normal flora of our body do to help prevent disease, and under what conditions may they cause disease? So we'll talk about where the normal flora are located, what areas of our body don't usually have it, and what happens when it gets there. So there's this interesting three groups of microorganisms that have some similarities to both bacteria and viruses. They're chlamydia, rickettsia, and mycoplasmas. They are like bacteria, they replicate by binary fission, but like viruses, they lack some basic components. Therefore, they are obligate intracellular parasites because they require the presence of living cells for reproduction. They are generally classified as bacteria, but they have a little bit of weirdity to them that don't make them quite like bacteria. So chlamydia is a common cause of sexually transmitted disease, and unfortunately, it can result in infertility if you're infected with it. They're considered primitive forms related to bacteria that lack many of the enzymes for metabolic processes. So there are some different forms that they exist in, and they use the host cells to make up for what they're missing, basically. That's why they're obligate parasites. Chlamydia is a sexually transmitted disease. It can cause pelvic inflammatory disease and sterility in women. Infants born from infected mothers can develop eye infections or pneumonia. So we'll talk about the transmission of different bacteria, but basically something that's sexually transmitted requires extreme measures basically to transmit to another person. So you're not just going to get it from somebody walking down the street, unlike some other things. So really, when we talk about disease transmission, knowing how an individual disease is transmitted is very important for preventing transmission of the disease and breaking the cycle. So rickettsia are tiny gram-negative bacteria that live inside a host cell. They're also obligate intercellular parasites. They're transmitted by vectors like lice and ticks, insect vectors. So that's another form of transmission. You have to be bitten by a lice or a tick in order to get this particular microorganism infection. They attack blood vessel walls. They cause diseases like typhus and Rocky Mountain spotted tick fever. They attack blood vessel walls and they cause a typical rash and small hemorrhages. So they're pretty easily identified that that's what's causing your disease. Mycoplasmas, they commonly cause pneumonia. They lack a cell wall. So because so many antimicrobial medications affect the cell wall of the bacteria, these mycoplasmas are not affected by those antimicrobial drugs. They can appear in many shapes, and they are the smallest cellular microbes. So because of their differences from bacteria and their differences from viruses, it's also hard to fight these things sometimes. So it's interesting. So fungi are found everywhere in the world, on animals, plants, on humans, in foods, you know, that sort of thing. They're all throughout the environment. So growth of various types of fungi can be seen easily on foods like cheese, fruit, or bread. They're often found on dead organic materials such as plants, like, you know, picture a log rotting in the forest with mushrooms growing on it. That's exactly what we're kind of talking about. So they can be, fungi can be microscopic, or they can be macroscopic, like mushrooms. That's a really good example of macroscopic ones. You can get a fungal or mycotic infection resulting from single cellular yeasts or multicellular molds. So fungi are eukaryotic. They contain a nucleus. So unlike bacteria, which have no nucleus, and viruses, which basically aren't cells, these guys are eukaryotic cells, just like we are. And only a few of them are pathogenic. They can cause a primary infection on skin or mucous membranes, but may spread systemically, particularly in immunosuppressed individuals. So some of the, so that kind of makes them a little bit opportunistic, if you want to think of it that way. A lot of times fungi can be either single cellular, or they can form complex complexes of cells, like mushrooms obviously are not single cellular. So examples of fungal diseases include histoplasma, which can cause neurologic disease and can be transmitted to the embryo or fetus if the mother's infected. Tinea pedis, which is athlete's foot. Candida albicans is yeast, which is usually harmless, but it's opportunistic. So it's the causative agent of thrush, which is usually a yeast infection in the mouth, usually in immunodeficient people, and vaginitis, which is a yeast infection, basically. There's a fungus called Pneumocystis I can't pronounce that. Some of the Latin words are really difficult to pronounce, but you can read. It causes pneumonia, and it has some characteristics of fungi and some protozoa. So lots of different things can cause pneumonia. Bacteria can cause pneumonia. Viruses can cause pneumonia. Fungi can cause pneumonia. Mycoplasmas can cause pneumonia. Aspiration of fluids can cause pneumonia. So pneumonia is one of the things that could kill you ultimately. And so all these different things could cause it. That's a problem, right? That's a big problem. Protozoa are sort of free-living, eukaryotic, single cellular organisms. They're unicellular. They don't hang out in groups. They lack a cell wall. A lot of them just hang out in streams, living independently. Some of them are obligate parasites where they live in another cell. The pathogenic ones are usually parasites. So the examples of protozoal diseases include trichomoniasis, which is found in uncooked pork, malaria, which has an insect vector, so food vector, insect vector, and amoebic dysentery, which is usually a water vector. So protozoa, because they're eukaryotes, they can be hard to kill as well. So that makes it interesting. Some diseases that are caused by protozoa they're opportunistic environmental type diseases, like you're exposed to an environment where there are mosquitoes or there's contaminated water. There are lots of other icky microorganisms that can make you sick or cause disease. One of them is they're called helminths, which are flatworms or roundworms. So some helminths are big enough to be seen with the naked eye, so they're not really classic microorganisms. They are parasites. They can be small or they can be up to 1 meter in length. So some flatworms can be up to 1 meter in length. Ick, right? They're the helminths that have a life cycle with at least 3 stages, where they have an ovum, a larva, and an adult stage. They enter your body through the skin or by ingesting in food or water contaminated, depending on the species. And infections are more commonly found in young children because their immune systems are not as developed. An infection can be life-threatening in an immunosuppressed client because the immune system can't fight them. So they're commonly found in young children because their immune systems aren't up to it. It can be life-threatening for an immunosuppressed person because their immune systems are not up to it. So Helminth diseases include pinworms. The ova of pinworms are inhaled in dust in fecally contaminated areas. So it's common in children worldwide. Hookworms enter the skin from fecally contaminated soil in tropical areas. So wear shoes. Well, you know, we don't really live in a tropical area, but yeah. Tapeworms are the most common form transmitted by larvae in undercooked pork. So that's trichomoniasis. Ascaris is a giant roundworm that's ingested with food that's been grown in feces contaminated soil or prepared with hands that have been in feces contaminated soil. So sanitation, hand hygiene, protecting your skin, those are all really important for preventing these types of diseases. So prions are interesting little things. They're protein-like agents that change the shape of proteins within host cells, and they're transmitted by contaminated tissues. So the ingestion of meat that's contaminated with prions, or infected blood or donor organs. These are horrible, horrible little things. They cause degenerative disease of the nervous system and are usually fatal. Human prion diseases include Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, otherwise known as mad cow disease. They're both progressive, rapidly progressive, and they're fatal. So there's not really a ton known about prion disorders. And it's basically an abnormal molecule that's transmissible in tissues or blood of animals or humans. So it basically affects the proteins in your brain. So that is not a good thing. You want to avoid these guys at all costs. So on to nicer things, our normal flora. So there's a lovely green and white chart in the book, my favorite, the green and white charts, that talk about where normal flora are present. So in our skin, our nasal cavity and mouth, or nose and pharynx, the gut, the colon and the rectum, the vagina and urethra. We have this population of mixed microorganisms that are actually doing a lot for us. They really different sites for different species of microorganisms, and certain microbes in our intestinal tract are benefit to us in the synthesis of vitamin K and in some digestive processes. These microbes aren't pathogenic under normal circumstances, but they're opportunistic pathogens. So if they're transferred to another location in the body, or if the balance between the species isn't maintained, like one variety becomes dominant, or if the host is immune deficient, they can become opportunistic pathogens. So resident flora is usually helpful in preventing other organisms from establishing a colony. So basically, these guys are taking up all the space so the baddies can't get in, if you want to think of it that way. So sometimes when you're on antibacterial drugs for another infection, treating another infection, it also destroys part of the normal flora in the intestine, allowing for an imbalance in the growth there or invasion by other microbes, causing opportunistic infection. And one of the symptoms of that can be diarrhea. So I'm sure we've all heard of probiotics and prebiotics. They're supplements that you take to really feed your normal flora and keep your normal flora balanced. So sometimes we can think of like, oh, let's just get rid of all the bacteria and viruses. If you could, I don't think you could, but we're living in a symbiotic relationship with our normal flora. They actually do a lot with us. We do have certain areas of our body that are supposed to be sterile of microorganisms: the blood, the cerebrospinal fluid, the lungs, the uterus and fallopian tubes and ovaries, and the bladder and kidney. Those should all be isolated and sterile from microorganisms. So a lot of those things are protected by the areas where normal flora are present. So our blood is protected by our skin. So if you have an opening in your skin, that is an invitation for other infectious agents to get into your blood and cause an infection. So, I mean, it is really interesting the balance that we live with these guys.